My name is Celeste Monroe. I am 32 years old, a corporate attorney, and I have spent my entire life proving that I could stand on my own. I worked my way through law school, built my career from the ground up, and never once asked my parents for a dime. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe, in their eyes, independence meant I didn't need them. Not their money, not their help, not even their love. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to hear. The rain fell in steady sheets as I stood by the freshly dug grave, the scent of wet earth clinging to the cold January air. My mother and father were gone, just like that. Their deaths, though not entirely unexpected, still left a hollow ache in my chest. I should have felt something deeper, grief, sadness, maybe even regret. But all I could focus on was the man standing across from me. My brother, Damian Monroe. He had barely spoken to me since we arrived at the cemetery, offering nothing more than a curt nod before turning away. I watched him, trying to decipher the strange ease in his posture. While I stood there, gripping a single white rose in my frozen fingers, lost in the weight of our loss, Damian was composed. Too composed. An hour later, I found myself sitting across from him in our family lawyer's office, the heavy scent of old books and polished wood filling the air. Mr. Rothwell, our parents' longtime attorney, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat before unfolding the document in his hands. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I told myself I wasn't expecting much. I never asked for anything. Still, when the words left his mouth, I felt as if the ground had been ripped from beneath me. To our beloved son, Damian Monroe, we leave the entirety of our estate, including all financial assets, properties, and holdings. To our daughter, Celeste Monroe, we leave nothing, as she has proven to be independent and successful, and does not require our assistance. Silence. I couldn't move. The words repeated in my head, over and over, like an echo I couldn't escape. I turned to Mr. Rothwell, waiting for him to explain, waiting for him to say there was some mistake. But his expression was carefully neutral, his fingers resting motionless on the desk. Damian exhaled a slow, satisfied breath before leaning back in his chair. He had the audacity to smirk. "Come on, Celeste," he said smoothly. "It's not like you needed anything. You have your career, your fancy degrees. Mom and Dad just knew I would put the money to better use." Better use? My blood ran cold. I forced myself to stay composed, but I could feel the rage bubbling just beneath the surface. This wasn't about the money. It wasn't about property or assets. This was about the fact that our parents, our own parents, had dismissed me as if I were nothing, as if I had worked my entire life only to be left behind. They thought I didn't need it. My voice was quieter than I intended, but every word was laced with disbelief. Damian shrugged, reaching for the glass of water in front of him. "You don't." I stared at him, studying his face. There was something there. Something just beneath the surface, hiding behind his carefully measured expression. He wasn't just confident, he was expectant, almost as if he had known this would happen, as if he had seen the will long before today. I turned to Mr. Rothwell. "When was this will written?" The lawyer hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Damian before landing back on me. "Not long before your father's passing." Something in my stomach twisted. That didn't make sense. My father had always been fair, strict but fair. He had always told me he was proud of me, that no matter what happened, he would take care of me. And now, suddenly, he had left me with nothing? Damian stood, straightening his expensive black suit with a nonchalant ease. "If you're done with the theatrics, I have a meeting to get to." I barely heard him. I was still staring at Mr. Rothwell, at the way his fingers twitched ever so slightly, the way his gaze avoided mine. Something was wrong. I rose from my chair, my voice steady. "I want a copy of the will." Damien chuckled, shaking his head. "Seriously, Celeste? What's the point?" I turned to face him, and for the first time, I let the mask slip. "Because something isn't right." He held my gaze, the smirk on his lips faltering for just a second. And in that second, I knew. He was hiding something. This wasn't over, not even close. I barely remembered leaving the lawyer's office. The words kept playing in my mind, over and over again. "To our daughter, Celeste Monroe, we leave nothing, as she has proven to be independent and successful, and does not require our assistance." Nothing. Nothing. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the estate. It was about what those words meant. I had spent my entire life trying to make my parents proud, proving that I could stand on my own. And now, it felt like that very independence had been used against me. I sat in my car, hands gripping the wheel, staring blankly at the rain-speckled windshield. Damien had known. The way he smirked, the way he leaned back in his chair like he had already won. It wasn't a surprise to him. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't even pretending to be. How long had he known? A sharp gust of wind rattled the car, and I exhaled, pressing my forehead against the steering wheel. I should have expected this. My entire childhood had been a lesson in being overlooked. Damien was the golden child. He had always been reckless, always the one in trouble, yet always the one getting second chances. When he crashed his first car at 17, our father had bought him another. When he flunked out of his first year of college, our mother convinced Dad to pay for a private tutor. When he burned through money in bad business deals, they helped him land new ones. And me? I had done everything right. Straight A's, scholarships, internships, law school, late nights, early mornings. I had built my own career without their help. And now, that was exactly why they had left me with nothing. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to push away the bitterness creeping into my chest. I wanted to believe there was a reason for this, that it wasn't just favoritism or carelessness. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. My father had always been fair, strict, but fair. He had always told me he was proud of me, that no matter what happened, he would take care of me. So why had he left me with nothing? I pulled my phone from my bag and scrolled through my contacts. My fingers hovered over Mr. Rothwell's number before I hesitated. If there was more to this, he wasn't going to tell me. I needed answers. My parents' house was only a few miles away. Damien had probably already been there, claiming whatever he wanted. But there was one thing I knew for certain. My father kept everything. Records, letters, contracts. If something had changed in the last few months, there would be a record of it. I started the engine and turned onto the empty road, my thoughts racing as fast as my heart. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I was going to find it. The weight of the revelation sat heavy on my chest as I drove toward my parents' house. The rain had slowed, leaving the streets slick and glistening under the dim glow of the streetlights. My fingers curled tightly around the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I wasn't just angry, I was unsettled. Something about this didn't feel right. Damien had known. That much was clear. But how long had he known? And more importantly, why had my father, the man who had always believed in fairness, changed his will so drastically before he died? The house loomed ahead, dark and quiet, standing in stark contrast to the warm, lively home it had once been. I hesitated before pulling into the driveway, an uneasy feeling stirring in my stomach. The last time I had been here was weeks before my father passed. He had been sick but still sharp, still himself. If he had made such a massive decision about his will, why hadn't he told me? I stepped out of the car, my heels clicking against the wet pavement as I approached the front door. My fingers brushed over the handle before I realized it was already unlocked. My pulse quickened. Damien had been here. Of course he had. But had he taken anything? Destroyed anything? I pushed the door open, the scent of aged wood and lingering cologne hitting me instantly. Everything inside was eerily untouched. My father's study light was still off, the books on the shelves perfectly aligned. If Damien had been here, he hadn't ransacked the place. Not yet. I moved quickly, making my way toward my father's desk. The drawers were locked? Of course they were. Frustration burned through me as I ran my hands along the surface, searching for anything out of place. My father always kept a spare key hidden somewhere in the study. I glanced around, my eyes landing on the old globe in the corner. A childhood memory surfaced, my father once showing me a secret compartment inside. I twisted the top, and sure enough, the key slid out into my palm. My breath hitched as I unlocked the drawer and pulled it open. Inside, stacks of paperwork sat neatly filed. Legal documents, bank statements, property deeds. But then, buried beneath it all, I spotted something else. A plain envelope, thick with folded papers inside. I pulled it out and carefully unfolded the pages. My heart pounded as I read the first line. Last Will and Testament of Theodore Monroe. Revised. Revised? I scanned the contents quickly, my hands trembling. This version was different. It was dated just 2 months before my father's death, and in it, everything had been split equally between Damien and me. This was the will I should have seen. So why hadn't I? A lump formed in my throat as I read my father's words. His intention was clear. He had never planned to leave me with nothing. He had made sure I was taken care of. But this wasn't the will Mr. Rothwell had read today. I flipped to the final page, my breath catching when I saw the signature line. It was blank. My father had never signed it. I stared at the page, my mind racing. He had written a new will. He had changed his mind. But for some reason, he hadn't been able to finalize it, and now the unsigned document meant nothing. Except... I ran my fingers over the paper, my gut twisting. My father had meant for this to replace the previous will. That much was obvious. Had he died before he could sign it? Or had someone made sure it never reached that point? I exhaled sharply, my grip tightening on the pages. There was no way this was just a coincidence. I needed to know what had really happened. And I had a feeling Damien already knew. I sat in my car with the unsigned will clutched in my hands, my mind spinning. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted down by everything it represented. My father had intended to change the will, but he never got the chance. Or worse, he was stopped before he could. Damien had known. I was sure of it now. He had walked into that lawyer's office too calm, too smug. He had expected my reaction, expected me to be blindsided. That meant he hadn't just seen the will before today, he had known exactly what it would say. A slow, chilling realization settled over me. The only person who stood to gain from that new will being discarded was Damien. The next morning, I walked into the office of the only person who could help me, Bryce Calloway, a litigator known for his cutthroat approach to estate disputes. His office smelled like coffee and leather, the kind of place where deals were made and secrets unraveled. Bryce leaned back in his chair, flipping through the pages of the unsigned will with an unreadable expression. Finally, he set it down and met my gaze. "This changes things," he said. I exhaled. "So it's worth contesting?" He gave me a sharp look. "Celeste, this is more than just contesting a will. If your father was pressured, manipulated, or—" He hesitated. "If anything happened that prevented him from signing this, then we're talking about more than just a legal battle. We're talking about fraud. Maybe worse." The air in the room seemed to thicken. I had suspected it, but hearing someone else say it made it feel real. I forced my voice to stay steady. "So what's the first step?" Bryce leaned forward. "We file a formal contest. It'll put Damien on the defensive, force him to justify why an unsigned will exists at all. And if there's even a shred of proof that something shady happened, we'll push for a full investigation." I nodded, but a pit of unease settled in my stomach. Damien wasn't just going to let this happen. He had already won in his mind. Challenging him would mean war. Bryce's eyes flickered with something close to amusement. "You sure you want to go through with this? It's going to get ugly." I met his gaze without hesitation. "I don't care how ugly it gets. I want the truth." He smiled slightly. "Good, because Damien won't go down without a fight." I already knew that, and I was ready for it. The formal contest was filed by the end of the day. I expected it to take a while to reach Damien, but I should have known better. By the time I got home, my phone was already ringing. I stared at the screen. Damien. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. I wasn't in the mood for his smug condescension or whatever excuses he was about to throw at me, but avoiding him wouldn't change anything. I took a deep breath and answered. "Celeste," he said, his tone clipped. "No pleasantries, no fake charm. Straight to business." "I assume you've heard," I said flatly. He let out a humorless chuckle. "Oh, I've heard. Do you have any idea what you're doing?" I sank onto my couch, gripping my phone tighter. "I'm doing what Dad would have wanted. You and I both know that will wasn't his final decision." He exhaled sharply, as if my words annoyed him. "You can't prove that. You have an unsigned piece of paper. That's it." A slow, bitter anger burned through me. "Dad meant to sign it, Damien, and you knew that, didn't you?" A pause. It was brief, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. My pulse quickened. "You knew. You're delusional," he snapped. "This is a waste of time, Celeste. You want to drag this through the courts? Fine. But when it's all over, you'll have nothing to show for it except legal fees and a public embarrassment." I gritted my teeth. "We'll see about that." I ended the call before he could say another word. For the first time since I'd read the will, I felt a sense of control. Damien was nervous, not outright panicked, not yet, but enough to call me the second he found out. That meant I was getting under his skin. The next day, Bryce called with an update. "You're not going to like this," he said. "Great," I muttered. "What now?" He hesitated. "Rothwell's firm is pushing back, hard. They're claiming that your father's final days were clear-headed, that there was no coercion, no foul play. They're going to try to shut this down before it gets traction." Of course they were. I ran a hand through my hair. "What about the timeline? Can we prove when he drafted the new will?" Bryce sighed. "Not definitively. There's no record of when he wrote it, only when it was last saved. And without a signature, legally speaking, it's worthless." Frustration clawed at my chest. I had evidence of my father's real intentions, but without a signature, it didn't matter. Unless... What if we prove he wanted to sign it? I asked suddenly. Bryce paused. Go on. What if someone stopped him? What if he told someone he was planning to change it? If we can get testimony, maybe even proof that he was manipulated, we have a case, right? Bryce was quiet for a moment, then he said, that might actually work. A spark of hope ignited in me. We need witnesses, Bryce continued. People who were around him before he died. Caretakers, doctors, friends. If he mentioned anything about changing his will, we can use that in court. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And I knew exactly where to begin. The hospital. My father had been in and out of care during his last months. If there was even a chance that someone had overheard him talking about the will, I had to find them. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. I wasn't just fighting for my fair share anymore. I was fighting for the truth. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet sorrow, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. I had been here more times than I could count in the months leading up to my father's death, but today, it felt different. Today, I wasn't just a grieving daughter. I was here for answers. The nurses at the front desk recognized me immediately. One of them, an older woman named Linda, gave me a small, sympathetic smile. Celeste, I'm so sorry about your father. I nodded, forcing a polite smile. Thank you, Linda. I actually wanted to ask if there was anyone on staff who spent a lot of time with him in his final days. Her expression shifted slightly, like she wasn't sure how to answer. Well, your father had a few nurses assigned to him, but the one who was with him the most was Sarah Whitmore. She worked the night shifts, and they talked a lot. Is she here now? I asked, my heart beating a little faster. She just finished her shift, but I can check if she's still in the building. I waited as Linda made a call, drumming my fingers against the counter. A few minutes later, a younger woman in scrubs appeared from the hallway. She looked exhausted, but when she saw me, her eyes softened with recognition. You're Mr. Monroe's daughter, she said. I nodded. Celeste, thank you for taking care of him. Sarah smiled slightly. He was one of my favorite patients. Always polite, always grateful, even when he was in pain. Then her smile faded. I heard about the will. I stiffened. You did? She hesitated. The other nurses were talking about it, about how strange it was, considering how much he talked about you. A flicker of something sharp and painful ran through me. What do you mean? Sarah glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening. Then she lowered her voice. Your father told me, more than once, that he was planning to change his will. He said he regretted how things had been set up. I think he was worried about something, but he never said what. My breath caught. This was exactly what I needed. Did he ever mention Damien? I asked. She bit her lip. Not directly, but there were nights when he seemed uneasy. He would stare at the ceiling for hours, lost in thought. And one night, right before he fell asleep, he told me, I need to make things right for Celeste, before it's too late. A cold chill ran down my spine. Before it's too late. I swallowed hard. Did he say why he hadn't changed it yet? Sarah shook her head. He just kept saying he needed to. He didn't seem to trust someone, but I don't know who. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady the storm brewing inside me. Sarah hesitated before adding, there was one night when a man came to visit him really late. I wasn't in the room, but I saw them talking. Mr. Monroe didn't look happy. I already knew the answer, but I asked anyway. Did you recognize him? She nodded. It was your brother. I felt like the floor had just been ripped out from under me. Damien had been here. He had been here, alone, with my father, right before he passed. 1,000 questions raced through my mind, but one stood out above all the others. What had Damien said to him that night? And had it been enough to stop my father from signing the will? Sarah touched my arm lightly. I don't know if this helps, but if you need me to testify, I will. I met her gaze, gratitude and determination mingling in my chest. It helps more than you know. I had come looking for answers, and now I had my first real lead. I left the hospital with my mind racing. Damien had been with my father that night, the night he told Sarah he needed to change the will. That couldn't be a coincidence. The cold air hit my face as I stepped outside, but I barely felt it. My hands were clenched into fists, my pulse drumming in my ears. Damien had done something. I could feel it. But feeling it wasn't enough. I needed proof. The drive to my apartment was a blur. I barely registered the passing cars, the streetlights streaking through the windshield. When I finally parked, I just sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. I had enough to raise suspicion, but not enough to win in court. I needed more, and I knew exactly where to start. The next morning, I was waiting outside Mr. Rothwell's office before it even opened. He wasn't happy to see me. His face tightened the moment I stepped inside, but he forced a polite smile as he gestured toward a chair. "Celeste?" he said, smoothing down his tie. "I assume you're here about the contest." I sat down, leveling him with a steady gaze. "I'm here about my father's will." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Celeste, I understand that this is difficult for you, but your father's estate was handled legally. I assure you, I know about the new will," I cut in. His expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of tension in his jaw. "The unsigned one," I continued. "The one where my father actually split the estate fairly." A heavy silence settled between us. He cleared his throat. "Miss Monroe, an unsigned document holds no legal weight. Even if your father had intentions of making changes, the fact remains that he did not finalize them." I leaned forward. "Why didn't he finalize them?" Rothwell shifted in his seat. "I wouldn't know." I studied him, reading the small tells, the way his fingers tapped against the desk, the way his shoulders stiffened slightly. He wasn't lying outright, but he was hiding something. "My father told people he was going to change it," I pressed. "And then, days before he died, my brother visits him at the hospital, alone. And suddenly, that will never get signed." Rothwell didn't move, but his silence told me everything I needed to know. Damien had something to do with this. I leaned back, forcing my voice to stay calm. "If you had nothing to do with it, then you won't mind handing over any records you have regarding my father's estate planning in his final months." Rothwell stiffened. "Those documents are confidential." I tilted my head. "They won't be when the court orders them released." His lips pressed into a thin line. He knew I was right. I stood up, adjusting my coat. "This isn't going away, Mr. Rothwell. If there's something you're not telling me, you might want to reconsider who you're protecting." I turned and walked out before he could respond. The second I stepped outside, my phone buzzed. A new text message. "Unknown number. You don't want to do this, Celeste. Drop it." I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering. It was starting. Damien knew I was getting too close. I stared at the text, my heart hammering in my chest. "Unknown number. You don't want to do this, Celeste. Drop it." The air around me suddenly felt thinner, as if the weight of those words had sucked the oxygen out of my lungs. My fingers tightened around my phone. There was no name attached, but I didn't need one. I knew exactly who had sent it. Damien. I sucked in a slow breath, forcing my pulse to steady. He was trying to rattle me, to make me second-guess myself. But all he had done was confirm what I already knew. He had something to hide. I took a screenshot of the message before deleting it. If this went to court, I wasn't giving him the satisfaction of knowing he had gotten under my skin. But I also wasn't stupid. I needed to be careful. If Damien was resorting to threats, it meant I was getting too close to something he didn't want me to find. I climbed into my car and called Bryce. The moment he answered, I didn't waste time. I just got a threat. That got his full attention. What kind of threat? I read the message aloud, and he swore under his breath. That's not subtle. No, it's not. Do you think it's him? I exhaled. It has to be. The timing is too perfect. I confronted Rothwell, and now I get a warning to back off? Damien knows I'm digging. Bryce was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You need an ally." I frowned. "I have you. You need someone who was close to your father, someone who can confirm what he really wanted." I thought back to Sarah at the hospital, the way she had hesitated before telling me she'd testify if needed. It was something, but it wasn't enough. I needed more than just a nurse's word. I needed someone Damien wouldn't be able to discredit. And then it hit me. Mr. Lennox, my father's oldest friend, a retired judge, a man who had known my dad longer than anyone. I hadn't seen him since the funeral, but if there was anyone who might know what my father was thinking in those last weeks, it was him. I pulled up his number and called. It rang twice before I heard his deep, familiar voice. "Celeste, Mr. Lennox, I need to talk to you. It's important." There was a long pause. Then, finally, he said, "Come by the house." I didn't hesitate. His house was a short drive away, nestled in a quiet neighborhood lined with ancient oak trees. When I pulled up, he was already waiting on the porch, watching me with sharp, knowing eyes. I barely made it up the steps before he spoke. "You're contesting the will." It wasn't a question. I nodded. "I found an unsigned version, one where my father split the estate fairly." Lennox's jaw tightened. I knew he was planning to change it. He told me himself. A sharp jolt went through me. He did. Lennox nodded slowly. "We had lunch a few weeks before he passed. He mentioned that he'd made a mistake in how he set things up, said he was going to fix it." I swallowed hard. "Do you think Damien had something to do with why he didn't?" Lennox's expression darkened. "Your father was a strong man, but in his final days, he was vulnerable. If someone wanted to manipulate him, it wouldn't have been difficult." The words hung heavy between us. I pulled out my phone and showed him the text message. "I got this today." Lennox's eyes flicked over the screen, and his mouth pressed into a firm line. "That's not just a warning, Celeste. That's a threat." I knew he was right, and for the first time, I started to wonder just how far Damien was willing to go to keep the truth buried. I sat across from Mr. Lennox in his quiet, book-lined study, my father's oldest friend watching me with a mix of concern and something else. Determination. The weight of his words still lingered in the air. "That's not just a warning, Celeste. That's a threat." I had known it the moment I saw the text, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel even more real. Damien wasn't just playing legal games anymore. He wanted to scare me into walking away. I took a slow breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. "If my father told you he planned to change the will, do you think he mentioned it to anyone else?" Lennox nodded, his gaze steady. "He did. There's someone you need to talk to." I leaned in. Who? He reached for a notepad and scribbled down a name. When he slid it across the desk, my stomach twisted. Jonathan Pierce. I recognized the name immediately. My father's former business partner. They had worked together for decades, built companies, made investments, even served on the same charity boards. If anyone knew the truth, it was him. Lennox met my eyes. Jonathan knew everything about your father's estate plans. They were close. If your father discussed changing the will with anyone outside the family, it would have been him. I nodded slowly, gripping the paper tightly. Do you know where I can find him? Lennox's mouth thinned. That's the problem. He left town after your father's funeral. No one's seen him since. A chill ran down my spine. He just disappeared? Lennox sighed. It's not like that. He has a place in the mountains. He likes to disappear for weeks at a time. But the timing is interesting, to say the least. Interesting? More like suspicious. I wasn't about to sit back and wait for Jonathan to return on his own. I needed answers now. I stood. Thank you, Mr. Lennox. If you hear from him, please let me know. Lennox's sharp gaze lingered on me for a moment before he finally nodded. Be careful, Celeste. You're playing a dangerous game. I knew that, but I wasn't backing down. The next morning, I tracked down an address for Jonathan's mountain home. A few calls, some favors pulled, and I had a location. I packed a bag, threw on my coat, and hit the road. The drive was long and winding, the highway giving way to narrow mountain roads covered in frost. The farther I went, the more isolated it felt. By the time I pulled up in front of a secluded cabin nestled between towering pine trees, the sun was already beginning to set. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching against the gravel. There was no movement inside, no sign of life. But his car was there, parked off to the side, dusted with a thin layer of frost. He was here. I approached the door and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. A prickle of unease crawled up my spine. I tried the handle. Locked. I was about to turn back when I noticed something. Just beneath the door frame, a thin slip of paper, as if it had been pushed under the door. I bent down and picked it up. The second I unfolded it, my breath caught in my throat. Celeste, I know the truth, but I'm not safe. Neither are you. Be careful who you trust. I'll find you when I can. My blood ran cold. Jonathan knew, and he was running. My fingers tightened around the note, my breath clouding in the cold mountain air. Celeste, I know the truth, but I'm not safe. Neither are you. Be careful who you trust. I'll find you when I can. Jonathan Pierce was running. From what or from whom, I wasn't sure, but I didn't need to guess. Damien. The thought sent a sharp chill down my spine, colder than the mountain wind cutting through my coat. Damien had made it clear he wasn't above threats. And if Jonathan knew something that could expose him, it meant my brother had already gotten to him. I turned and scanned the tree line, my nerves on high alert. The quiet felt unnatural, too thick, like the woods were holding their breath. I needed to get out of here. If Jonathan was gone, there was no reason to stay. And if Damien knew I was looking for him, I didn't want to find out how far he'd go to stop me. I shoved the note into my pocket and hurried back to my car. The engine rumbled to life, and I wasted no time backing out of the driveway, gravel crunching under the tires. My pulse didn't slow until I was miles away, back on the open road, the dense trees fading in my rearview mirror. Jonathan had given me no answers, only more questions. But now I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't just fighting for my inheritance anymore. I was fighting to uncover something much bigger. The next morning, I walked into Bryce's office, tossed the note onto his desk, and crossed my arms. "We need to escalate this." He picked up the note, read it quickly, and frowned. "This is bad." "No kidding." Bryce exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "Jonathan was our best chance at proving your father intended to change his will. If he's disappeared, then we find him," I interrupted. "I don't care how long it takes." Bryce shook his head. "We don't have that luxury. Damien is already preparing to fight back. I got a notice this morning. He's officially contesting your challenge. His lawyers are moving fast to shut it down before it ever reaches court." I clenched my jaw. Of course he was. "What's their argument?" Bryce flipped open a folder. "They're claiming your father was of sound mind when he finalized his will, and that there's no valid evidence to suggest he wanted to change it." He looked up at me. "They're also painting you as the greedy, bitter daughter who just can't accept reality." A laugh of disbelief escaped my lips. "Of course they are." Bryce's expression darkened. "And there's more. Damien's lawyers are pushing the angle that you were estranged from your parents and had no right to expect anything from the estate." I stiffened. "That's a lie." "I know," he said, "but they only need to convince the court that there's enough doubt to throw out your case." My fists clenched at my sides. Damien wasn't just fighting to keep what he stole, he was trying to rewrite history. I took a deep breath, pushing down the anger. Then we hit back harder. Bryce's lips twitched into a faint smirk. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." He slid another file across the desk. "We subpoena Rothwell's records. If your father had any emails, notes, or meetings about changing the will, it'll be in there." I nodded. "And we go after the hospital records. If Damien was with my father the night before he died, there could be proof, security footage, visitor logs, something." Bryce gave an approving nod. "Now you're thinking like a lawyer." I exhaled, my mind spinning through the next steps. "We also need a judge who's willing to take this seriously. We can't let Damien bury this before we get the chance to fight." Bryce's eyes gleamed. "Leave that to me." I stood up, my resolve hardening. "And I'll find Jonathan. He knows the truth, Bryce, and if he's running, it's because Damien doesn't want him talking." Bryce nodded. "Be careful, Celeste. Damien isn't going to stop." I met his gaze, steel in my voice. "Neither am I." That evening, I sat in my apartment, sifting through old files, searching for anything I might have missed. A knock at the door jolted me from my thoughts. I frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late. Too late for visitors. Slowly, I got up and approached the door. "Who is it?" Silence. My pulse quickened. Another knock. This time, softer. I hesitated, then reached for the deadbolt. When I opened the door, my breath caught. Jonathan Pierce stood there, his face pale, his eyes darting behind him as if he'd been followed. "We need to talk," he whispered, "before it's too late." Jonathan looked exhausted. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and there was an uneasiness in his expression that sent a fresh wave of tension through me. His eyes darted over my shoulder before he stepped inside, his movements hurried, paranoid. I locked the door behind him. "Jonathan, what the hell is going on?" He ran a hand through his graying hair, pacing in the small entryway of my apartment. "I don't have much time," he muttered, glancing toward the windows as if expecting someone to be watching. I folded my arms. "You disappeared after my father's funeral. Now, suddenly, you show up at my door? After leaving me that note?" He exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. "Celeste, your father, he knew something wasn't right." I stilled. "What do you mean?" Jonathan hesitated, then met my gaze. He told me he was changing the will. Not just once, but multiple times. He didn't trust Damien. A sharp pang of validation surged through me, mixed with growing dread. Then why didn't he? Jonathan looked away, guilt flickering across his face. Because Damien got to him first. The room suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. My nails dug into my palms. Explain. Jonathan let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping. Your father had a plan. He was going to sign the new will. I was supposed to be a witness, along with Rothwell. But a week before it was supposed to happen, Damien showed up. After that, everything changed. My stomach twisted. What did he do? Jonathan's jaw clenched. I don't know the details, but after Damien's visit, your father stopped talking about changing the will. Every time I brought it up, he just brushed it off, told me not to worry about it. I shook my head. That doesn't sound like my father. It wasn't, Jonathan agreed. But he was weaker by then. And Damien, he has a way of getting what he wants. A cold shiver ran through me. Are you saying he threatened him? Jonathan hesitated, and in that moment I knew. He wasn't just guessing. He knew Damien had done something. He just didn't want to say it out loud. I took a slow step closer. Jonathan, if my father was pressured, coerced, into not signing that will, that's fraud. If we can prove it, we can overturn it. He let out a bitter laugh. You think I don't know that? I tried talking to Rothwell after your father died. He wouldn't listen, told me to leave it alone. I exhaled sharply. Of course he did. Damien probably got to him too. Jonathan glanced at the door again. This isn't just about the will, Celeste. That's why I left town. I was being followed. My stomach dropped. Followed? By who? I don't know, he admitted. But I started noticing strange cars near my house. People watching me. Then I got a message. He pulled out his phone, scrolling quickly before handing it to me. The text was short. Director, leave the will alone, or else. I stared at the words, my grip tightening on the phone. Damien wasn't just making threats. He was actively silencing anyone who could expose him. I handed the phone back, my mind racing. Jonathan, I need you to testify. If you go on record saying my father planned to change the will— No, he interrupted, shaking his head. I can't. I felt a wave of frustration. Jonathan, you don't get it, he snapped. I'm already in danger. If I step forward, I could disappear next, just like your father. The words sent an icy chill down my spine. I swallowed hard. What are you saying? Jonathan hesitated, his face tense. Then he lowered his voice to a whisper. I don't think your father's death was natural. The air in the room shifted. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and for a moment I couldn't move. I had spent weeks questioning why my father never signed that will, wondering why Damien had been so calm, so confident that he would get everything. But I had never considered this. I forced myself to find my voice. You think Damien? I don't know, Jonathan admitted. But your father was getting better. Slowly, but better. And then, just like that, he was gone. I shook my head, trying to process it. He had health issues. The doctors— Jonathan gave me a sharp look. Did you see the medical records? I hesitated. No. His expression hardened. Then maybe you should. A new wave of determination surged through me. I wasn't just fighting for my inheritance anymore. I was fighting for the truth about my father's death. The room felt different now, heavier, darker. Jonathan's words echoed in my head. I don't think your father's death was natural. I had been so focused on the will, on Damien's deception that I never even considered the possibility that my father's death wasn't just a tragic event, but something orchestrated. I took a slow breath, forcing my thoughts to steady. If there's even a chance that Damien was involved, I need proof. Jonathan nodded, his jaw tight. Then you need the medical records. If anything was off, medications, sudden changes in his condition, it'll be there. My mind was already racing. My father had spent his last weeks in the hospital, which meant his full medical history was on file. I needed those records. But I knew one thing for sure. If Damien had any involvement, he would have already found a way to bury the evidence. I have to get them before Damien does, I murmured. Jonathan hesitated, then pulled out his phone. I might know someone who can help. I watched as he scrolled through his contacts before pressing a call. The line rang twice before someone picked up. Sarah, he said, his voice calm but firm. My pulse quickened. Sarah, the nurse from the hospital. Jonathan? Her voice crackled through the speaker. I need a favor. He glanced at me before continuing. Celeste needs her father's medical records. All of them. There was a beat of silence. Then Sarah let out a slow breath. You know I could lose my job for this, right? Jonathan's voice was gentle. I know, but if I'm right, this is bigger than your job. Another pause. Then, meet me at my place in an hour. The call ended. I exhaled. She'll do it? Jonathan nodded. She knows something isn't right. An hour later, we met Sarah at her small apartment on the outskirts of the city. She looked nervous, clutching a thick manila folder in her hands. This is everything, she said, handing it to me. I copied the full medical report before they could restrict access. I took the folder, my hands slightly unsteady as I flipped it open. My father's name was printed at the top, along with dates and medical notes. As I scanned through the pages, my eyes landed on something that made my breath hitch. Medication administered, morphine. Dosage increased in final days. That wasn't right. I looked up at Sarah. My father wasn't on high doses of morphine before. Why would it be increased? Her face darkened. That's the thing. He wasn't in enough pain to justify it. His attending physician never authorized that much. I felt my stomach twist. Then who did? Sarah exhaled. The order came from a specialist, someone outside his regular team. She hesitated before adding, Dr. Eric Langley. The name meant nothing to me, but Jonathan's face went rigid. What? I asked, sensing his reaction. Jonathan's voice was low. Eric Langley isn't just any doctor. He's a close friend of Damien's. A chill ran through me. Damien had connections at the hospital. Damien had access to my father's care, and somehow, in his final days, my father had been given increased doses of a powerful drug that he didn't need. I swallowed hard. We need to find Dr. Langley. Sarah shook her head. He resigned right after your father passed. No one's heard from him since. I gritted my teeth. Of course he did. Jonathan exhaled sharply. This isn't just a legal battle anymore, Celeste. If Damien had a hand in this, we're dealing with something much bigger. I clenched my fists, my resolve hardening. Damien had gone too far, and I was going to prove it. The next morning, Bryce was waiting for me in his office, flipping through the medical records with an expression that could have cut steel. You're telling me that your father was given unnecessary morphine in his final days by a doctor with ties to Damien, and now that doctor has conveniently disappeared? His voice was cold, calculating. I nodded. That's exactly what I'm saying. Bryce tossed the file onto his desk. This changes everything. We need to take this to court, I said. Now. Bryce hesitated. We don't have enough yet. I clenched my jaw. Are you kidding me? We have a doctor with suspicious ties to my brother, increased dosages that weren't authorized, and a missing witness who knew my father wanted to change his will. Bryce exhaled. It's suspicious, but suspicion isn't enough. If we go to court now, Damien's lawyers will rip us apart. We need something solid, something that directly links Damien to the manipulation. I gritted my teeth, frustration burning through me. Then we get it. A silence settled between us before Bryce nodded slowly. We're going to need a forensic accountant. I frowned. What? If Damien was involved, there's a money trail somewhere, Bryce explained. Bribery, shell companies, payments to Dr. Langley. If we can follow the money, we might be able to connect him directly to the fraud. It was a long shot, but it was a shot. I exhaled. Then let's do it. Bryce leaned back in his chair, studying me. You know, Celeste, once we go down this road, there's no turning back. I met his gaze, my voice unwavering. I never planned on turning back. Bryce nodded, his lips curving into a small smirk. Then let's bring him down. The following week was a whirlwind of investigation. Bryce brought in one of the best forensic accountants in the city, a no-nonsense woman named Elise Carter, who had a reputation for uncovering financial crimes no one else could. Days passed as she worked through Damien's financials, combing through bank transactions, offshore accounts, and hidden assets. Then, late one night, my phone rang. I answered immediately. Tell me you found something. Elise's voice was sharp. Not just something. Everything. I sat up, my pulse racing. There's a payment made 6 months ago, Elise continued. A large sum transferred from one of Damien's holding accounts to a private medical fund. And guess whose name is on it? I gripped the phone tighter. Dr. Eric Langley. Bingo, she said. Not only that, there's a pattern. Smaller payments leading up to your father's final weeks. Looks like hush money. My breath caught. I had him. Damien didn't just manipulate the will. He had financially incentivized the doctor responsible for my father's care. I clenched my jaw. Send me everything. The truth was no longer just a suspicion. It was real, tangible. And now, I had the proof I needed to destroy Damien in court. I sat in Bryce's office, staring at the evidence Elise had uncovered. The documents were spread across the desk, bank transfers, signed authorizations, timestamps that lined up too perfectly. Damien had paid off Dr. Langley. He had manipulated our father's medical care, and worst of all, he had made sure that will was never signed. Bryce leaned forward, tapping the papers with a finger. This is it. This is what we needed. I exhaled slowly, my heart pounding. So what happens next? Bryce's expression was razor sharp. We file a motion to not only contest the will, but to launch a full investigation into medical fraud. If the judge accepts the evidence, Damien won't just lose his inheritance. He could be looking at criminal charges. A lump formed in my throat. I had wanted justice, wanted my fair share, but now, this was bigger than just the estate. This was about what Damien had done to our father. Bryce must have read my thoughts because his voice softened. Are you ready for this? I clenched my fists. Yes. Bryce gave a firm nod. Then let's take him down. The courtroom was packed. Damien sat at the defendant's table, his jaw tight, his posture stiff, but his eyes still held that familiar arrogance, like he thought this would all blow over. But when Elise took the stand and presented the financial records, I saw the first crack in his composure. When Sarah testified about the increased morphine dosages and Dr. Langley's disappearance, his fingers twitched against the table, And when Jonathan Pierce confirmed that my father had intended to change the will and that Damien had been the last person alone with him before his condition suddenly worsened, Damien finally lost his cool. He shot up from his seat. "This is all speculation." His voice was sharp, angry. "You have no proof that I did anything wrong." The judge silenced him with a single glare. "Mr. Monroe, sit down, or I will hold you in contempt." Damien sat, but I could see it in his face now. He was losing. His lawyer tried everything, argued that the financial records were unrelated, that my father had simply changed his mind, that this was all some bitter attempt by me to claim what was never mine. But the evidence spoke louder than their excuses, and when the verdict was delivered, it was undeniable. The court ruled in my favor. The will was overturned. Damien was stripped of his inheritance, but that wasn't all. The judge ordered a full investigation into my father's medical treatment, and when Dr. Langley was finally found, hiding in another state under a fake name, he confessed. Damien had paid him off, paid him to keep increasing my father's medication, to make him weaker, more dependent. And in the end, that medication had played a role in his death. Damien hadn't just stolen the inheritance. He had killed our father. 2 months later, I stood outside the courthouse, the cool air wrapping around me as I watched Damien being escorted into a police car. His trial for medical fraud and manslaughter was only beginning, but I knew how this story would end. He had spent his whole life thinking he could take what he wanted, that he could manipulate and lie his way into control. But this time, he lost. Bryce stood beside me, hands in his pockets. "You did it," he said. I exhaled, my breath visible in the cold. "Yeah. You okay?" I thought about that for a moment. I had won my fair share of the inheritance, but it wasn't just about that anymore. It was about justice, for my father, for the truth. And in a way, I had already lost my brother long before today. I turned to Bryce and gave a small nod. "Yeah, I think I am." As Damien was driven away, I felt something lift from my chest, a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying. For the first time in a long time, I was free. I turned away from the courthouse, walking toward a future that finally belonged to me.